Hey, Karen. Hi.
Merry Christmas.
We don't have very many choices.
We get to rock, paper, scissors.
Well, there's only 3 people here.
Well, they may not be on time, but we are, aren't we? So we're going to go ahead and start this. Of course, we expected quite a few people not to be. Sister Mary Ann came in. So we got the other class started downstairs, so that's good as well. Would you bow with me in prayer? Dear Father in heaven, we're so thankful for this beautiful day that we have. Every day is a gift from you, of life. And we think of life, we think of the joys of life, and we also think of the opportunities that we have. We pray, dear God, as eternally bound creatures and those who love you, that we may consider those opportunities before us this day. And above all things, may your name be glorified, and may we serve you as your God, as our God, in love and devotion. We pray for those who are traveling and those even on their way here, that they may have a safe arrival. We know it's a holiday. We also know that it is very cold, and we pray, dear God, that you'd keep our loved ones safe. We ask you to be with us in our study at this time. In Jesus' name, amen. Let me turn this thing off. Okay. All right, we're on week 52. And if you have one of the outlines, it's called The Great Confession. And I've already received a word concerning the outline being sent out in preparation for today, last week. Oh, it's so dark. Well, if you notice the ones that we have here in the auditorium, not only are they dark printed here, but they're also dark online. And there's not much that we can do about it. We haven't had a problem like this before, but I hope that you can at least read through the lettering. Just has a dark background. And so this week we're going to be looking at 3 key events in the life of Christ. And we're going to be using Mark chapter 8 as our primary text for the first 2 events. And then we're going to be going to Mark chapter 16 with the last one. Matthew 16, yes, for the last one. If someone asks you, whom do you say that Jesus is? What do you say? We're going to see that in our second part. And that's why our lesson today is called The Great Confession. We know it's a confession of Peter. When Jesus posed that question before his own apostles. And I want you to notice so far that they haven't been recognizing him as the Son of God. He puts this out before them. And they have various other suggestions until Peter will give his good confession. In our last lesson, Jesus fed the 4,000. But let's don't forget that this was a time in which Jesus continued to withdraw himself from the people. He was trying to find time alone with his apostles. And so he's going to withdraw again. And one of the ways he does that is what? Traveling back and forth across the Sea of Galilee. That seems to be about the safest place he can have. And I have an idea that as they as they're rowing across or they're sailing across, Jesus is able to talk to them alone. Because anytime they're on land, he's overwhelmed with people trying to get to him, wanting him to heal their sick. And so this is going to happen a couple of times in our lesson, that Jesus is going to withdraw with his own apostles. We are going to reach a climactic part in Jesus' ministry over the next several weeks. It's interesting to be able to say this in light of the fact that in our last lesson, we talked about what some Bible scholars have referred to as the collapse of the Galilean ministry. And you remember when Jesus, especially from John chapter 6, when Jesus completed his sermon on the bread of life, that his would-be disciples, those who considered themselves to be disciples, were offended by this. And they walked away, even to the extent that it seems like nobody was left except for the apostles. And he wants to know if they too will go away. And we can only imagine the confusion that they had in their own minds. Yes, some people refer to this as the collapse of the Galilean ministry, but I don't think it was a collapse at all. Rather, Jesus makes a course correction with many of these Jewish followers, simply because they were following him for the wrong reasons. And that needed to be corrected. I'll never forget when I had a Bible professor in graduate school that actually suggested that Jesus made a mistake here. That if he hadn't preached that sermon, then he would have lost so many disciples. But what good would these people be if they continued in that? You know, we have the same type of problems today when it comes to church growth and church attendance. People will do all kinds of wild things to try to get people to come to church. But they come to church for the wrong reasons. Well, maybe to be entertained or for social events and that type of thing. It's not really for the purpose of devoting their lives to Christ. And so Jesus does not back off of this at all. He told them what they must do. They must eat of his flesh and drink of his blood. In other words, they must partake of his divine nature. And this is something that they're wanting to debate with them, because they want religion their way, just like people do today. And so in contrast to these Jewish followers that they have been so far on the western side of the Sea of Galilee, we see that Jesus has reached many Gentiles who are following Jesus for the right reasons. And I think oftentimes we fail to see this. They saw his miracles as signs that prove that he is truly the Son of God. And what is striking about this is that it's Matthew's gospel that keeps bringing this up. And remember, Matthew is written to a Jewish audience, and he's saying to them, well, the Gentiles are accepting Jesus. Our people are not. We saw this with the Syrophoenician woman, who would not be discouraged nor turned away from Jesus simply because she was a Gentile. She expressed her faith in Jesus, and she said, "I'd be satisfied with just the crumbs," you know. And that's what she stated, and as a result, her daughter was healed. And last week we saw from Matthew chapter 15 and verse 31 that when Jesus returned to that area on the east side of the Sea of Galilee, that many people, apparently most of which were Gentiles, had the lame and the blind and the mute being healed. And remember what we read in Matthew 15:31? Again, Matthew is the one that brings this up. Gentiles are glorifying the God of Israel. But the Jews aren't doing that. But the Gentiles are. It seems that Gentiles more easily identified Jesus as the Jewish Messiah than the Jews did. In fact, take a look at John chapter 1, verses 10 through 13. John chapter 1, verses 10 through 13. Because at the very beginning of John's gospel, we see this happening. Sister Jennifer, do you have that for us? Verses 10 through 13.
He was in the world, and the world was made through him, and the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own did not receive him. But as many received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, and to those who believed in his name, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God.
Okay, so it says that he came to his own, and his own did not receive him. Who were those who were of his own? The Jews, you see. They actually felt like that they were the privileged group. And of course, the gospel would go to the Jews first. Jesus was a Jew. But from that point on, it's an even plane for all people. And what the Jews rejected, the Gentiles were seeing, at least on a number of occasions thus far, are receiving of Jesus. Why do you think are some of the reasons that the Jews rejected Jesus as being their Messiah? We talked about a few of these previously. What are some of them?
Preconceived ideas, especially those that came out of the Apocrypha.
Well, they had preconceived ideas concerning the kingdom. I guess is what you're saying. Yeah, they were looking for an earthly kingdom. What else do you see was a cause of their rejection? Didn't they claim to know who Jesus really was? Yeah, well, we know his mommy and daddy and all that type of thing. And so they were not about to receive him as being the Son of God. Many say that today's lesson was yet another great turning point in his ministry. And let's just in the next couple of lessons of what we're going to be looking at. First of all, as we get into today's lesson, and of course Wednesday night, we're getting into the good confession of Peter. And it's going to be important to see how Peter is changing. He's the one that speaks up with the right answer, where the other apostles of Jesus are saying, well, who do men say the Son of Man is? And they'll say, well, some say this, some say that, which really is non-committal on their part. But what Jesus was interested in was, who do you say that I am? And of course, Peter is the one that comes with the right answer. So we got the good confession. And then we're going to be looking at the unveiling of Christ's plan to build his church. You realize that these points are still being debated today by those who claim to be Christians? There are those who deny the virgin birth. They claim to be Christians. They deny that Jesus is deity. They don't believe that Jesus built one church, and even if he did, they don't think the church is all that important that you can be saved without it. And I think even in the church, we've made a grave mistake in trying to appeal to people on this. When I was growing up, we emphasized the church. We emphasized the identity of the church. We looked at the scriptures to see the church that Jesus built. But nowadays, all we're concerned is that we're saved. It's as though we are borrowing this from the denominational neighbors around us, as though we have to give an answer to them, and they're not interested in the church because they say one church is just as good as another. And that has been our strong point, and we've given up on it. And then thirdly, we have the first clear and unambiguous announcement concerning Jesus' death, burial, resurrection, and also his second coming. And then that's followed by the transfiguration. These are really pivotal points in Jesus' ministry. That's what we're going to be studying in the next couple of lessons. And this week we'll get to the good confession and Christ's announcement of the church. But before we do, we have a few stops to make along the way. First of these is while he's in Galilee, he's attacked by the Jews. Remember, we read these readings this past Wednesday evening concerning the Jews coming to Jesus and demanding a sign of him. I went ahead and read that so you could see the transition of this. We really didn't get into any discussion of it. And we noted specifically at that time that many Gentiles came to understand who Jesus is, while at the same time the Jews refused to acknowledge who Jesus is. And we also noted at the end of the lesson, as we read from Matthew chapter 16, that Peter will come up with the right answer to the question of who Jesus is. Now, our lesson is actually, this week's lesson is going to take us from Mark 8, verses 10 through 21. But the only time limit that we have today is we're going to be focusing on verses 10 through 13. So we're going to be reading from Mark chapter 8, verses 10 through 13. Do you have that for us?
Mm-hmm. Can I start at 9? Because 10 is like in the middle of a sentence.
Okay, you can start with 9.
Now those who had eaten were about 4,000, and he sent them away. Immediately he got into the boat with his disciples and came to the region of Dalmanutha. Then the Pharisees came out and began to dispute with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven, testing him. But he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, "Why does this generation seek a sign? Assuredly I say to you, no sign shall be given to this generation." And he left them, and getting into the boat again, departed to the other side.
You see, how many times are they going across the sea? And so he's been on the east side. They get in the boat, and they travel back over onto the west side. This region, Dalmanutha, scholars can't really identify where it is, but it's believed to be very close to Magdala. So that's why I said. That's why I said, Steve. Yeah, it's near that area. They believe, but they can't really identify the exact location, but it's on the western side of the Sea of Galilee. Could be a little bit southwest of that region.
How long does it take to get from one side to the other? Like in all of these traveling? You know, I'm just curious. Like how long? And this is,
Well, let's see, how long did it take to cross it in the storm? So,
One way famous persons from there, Maryland.
yeah. I think it was just only a couple hours. The sea is not really that big to get across there. Whether you're rowing or you're sailing, you know, it's hard to. Well, depends upon how the wind conditions are. You know, if they're strong winds, it may not take you very long at all. And it took no time at all after Jesus got into the boat, because they were at the shore all of a sudden. You remember reading that? And here they'd been out there all night trying to get across, and immediately they reached the shore. And so Jesus was on the east side of the Sea of Galilee when he fed the 4,000. Then they got into a boat and went back to the west side. And we're reading here that the Pharisees came. And Matthew 16 and verse 1, we won't read it, also adds that the Sadducees accompanied them, which is kind of a strange thing. Because you don't usually see Pharisees and Sadducees together.
All of these big streets, bedfellows.
So, yeah, they were here to discredit Jesus. They recognized that he was a force that they had to contend with.
they were united in their.
Hatred towards Jesus. Yes, they were united in their hatred towards Jesus. And so when they when they come, they're testing him. They're trying to trip him up so that he would be discredited among the people. But there are not many times, as I said before, that they come together because they just did not agree, good or bad. Now, Mark 8 and verse 11, which was just read to us, says that they were seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. Interesting that they would use the word sign, because I think down deep they understood the purpose of the miracles of Jesus. What did we say the difference was between miracles and signs?
There was a supernatural power that activity right there, right now. A sign points to something else greater than itself.
Yeah, when you're talking about miracles, you're talking about something that's designed to bring awe or wonder in the minds of people. And when we're talking, usually, really, when you talk about supernatural, I think maybe people get in their minds that, well, that's the same as miracle. No, to talk about supernatural, you're talking about God's involvement in it, whether it is miraculous or not. And what they're demanding from Jesus is a sign that would convince them that God was in support of Jesus and his ministry, or that Jesus was whom he claimed to be. And this is an interesting thing to study, and I find it very helpful to me as well, because we're dealing with evidence. They claimed that the miracles he had done were not convincing to them. They were seeking a supernatural proof that God was working through Jesus. You know, sometimes people are so determined not to accept the obvious that no amount of evidence will ever convince them of anything that they do not want to accept. And I say some people, may we say most people, and of course we would say, well, that wouldn't include me. But maybe sometimes it does include us. Maybe it includes me. It doesn't matter how much evidence you present and what the evidence points to. You're just not going to, you'll never convince me that this is true. We find that true when we had the public discussions on the existence of God. You know, you try to present the evidence that demands the conclusion that God exists, that we are here through the miraculous power of God in creation. Well, we're not going to accept any type of miraculous explanation, but you have nothing else to give. And so I find it rather helpful, instead of allowing them to put the burden of proof on my back, put the burden of proof on their back. In other words, it's impossible for God not to exist. So every created thing, every occurrence in nature, as we would refer to it, then you're obligated to explain to me how that happened. Well, they don't want to have the burden of proof. They just want to sit there with their arms crossed and say, I won't accept that. I deny that. And when you're going through the gospel accounts and Jesus has met with people with that type of attitude, what is that called? Yes, hardened hearts. That's what it is. Call it for what it is. They're suffering from hardened hearts, so that they will not allow what is said to penetrate their conscience. It seems that, though, that they were seeking a sign from the sky. When you compare Mark chapter 8, verse 11, and Mark 16 and verse 1. Matthew 16, verse 1. Oh, okay, I said Mark 8, 11, Matthew 16 and verse 1. Okay. Why, according to Matthew 16:4, did Jesus say a wicked and adulterous generation seeks after a sign? Why does he say that? Do you read it? It's a wicked generation, isn't it?
Yeah, because they won't listen to obvious statements.
And why were they wicked? Why does he call them wicked? Matthew 16:4, a wicked and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign shall be given it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. And of course you read there that he says this, he performs no sign, he leaves them. To me, there's an awful lot to be considered when working with people of this nature. Why are they wicked?
Well, go back to the previous verses.
Okay.
Now, the verse that says they came up to Joseph's son and from heaven. He replied to him,
Right.
Miracles that Jesus had already performed should have included that.
So we're really dealing with dishonesty, aren't we, Steve? And that's wicked. By the way, verses 2 and 3, there's a lot of discussion by textual scholars whether that belongs there. And there's not strong evidence that it doesn't belong there. But some have suggested that this came from Luke chapter 12, verses 54 through 56, which is a similar reading. So we're not going to discuss that now. We'll wait till we get to that. And in the context of what Jesus says there. But they're seeking a sign from heaven. Very interesting statement. It indicates a sign from the sky. So these people were wicked because they deliberately evaded the plain evidence of Jesus to previous miracles which revealed God's will. Now, he says that they're wicked and they're an adulterous relationship. Why would he call them adulterous? You know, it's easy for us to read words like that and just move on. Well, this is not name calling. He's identifying what their problem is. They're wicked because they do not receive what the evidence demands, and he's given them ample evidence, and now they're still looking for a sign. And he's given them signs. And now he calls them an adulterous generation. Yes?
Is that because they're like serving two masters?
Yes, it is.
The world, half of the world, half of the world.
That's exactly what it is. They were unfaithful in that they loved something other than God. And we can actually read of this. I won't, I'll give you the reference. You can read it in John chapter 5, verses 38 through 47. Again, that's John chapter 5, verses 38 through 47, in which Jesus goes into quite a bit of detail regarding this, in that they preferred the approval of one another more than God's approval. You know, a lot of people do not reject Christianity because it simply is not the popular thing to do anymore. They'll be criticized by it. And they're trying to please the world. They don't realize this. But they're trying to please the world instead of trying to please God. And so they pretend that the evidence for God and for Christianity just isn't there. But it is there. And if they're convinced that it's not there, they're not going to seek it out. And so that's why he calls them a wicked and adulterous generation. They were unfaithful in what they loved. They claim to be loving God. They come to Jesus with the pretense that we are protecting God, aren't they? We're the keepers of the faith. And they're rejecting it. And Jesus is exposing them, and they hate him because he shows them for what they are. People react the same way today. So when you're thinking about signs, when you're thinking about a sign from heaven, or it could be a sign in the sky, Jesus says they have already received from heaven signs, and they've rejected those signs. Let's consider a few of them. What about the testimony of John? John the Baptist. In fact, we haven't come to it. It won't be until later. Jesus will even ask them. He said, "The baptism of John, whence was it? From heaven or from men?" And they knew the answer to that. So if they got a sign from heaven, they would reject it. Indeed, they have rejected it. And what happened at Jesus' baptism?
He looked up and speaking on
Yeah.
up.
From above the sky. That's a sign from the sky. Yeah. And the voice from heaven?
Yes.
This is my beloved Son?
Did everybody hear that? Did John?
Well, a lot of them had came out to investigate John the Baptist, hadn't they? And there'd been others that would have testified to that. But they didn't want anything to do with it. You had the healing of various diseases. We read back in chapter 12 of Matthew, verse 28. I think one of the most powerful that's overlooked, because we live in such a skeptical society, is the fulfillment of prophecy. In John 1:45 and Matthew 11, verses 4 and 5, just to mention a few of these. And then we have the multiplicity of signs. Now, what's interesting is that you have a divide between the people and these religious leaders who are there to discredit him. The people are seeing a lot of these things for themselves. Take a look just for a moment to John chapter 7 and verse 31. An interesting statement is found there. And of course, Jesus has been doing signs. You have also his teaching is incomparable to anything that the scribes and Pharisees could offer them. And it says in verse 31, and many of the people believed in him and said, when the Christ comes, will he do more signs than these which this man has done? They see it, don't they? And so now the Pharisees and the Sadducees are coming to Jesus, and what are they demanding? A sign. And the people are saying, well, when the Messiah comes, will he do any more signs than what Jesus has done? I imagine that, hear the people say that, just really irritated the Pharisees and Sadducees. And we're understanding why Jesus says what he does and walks away. Because to present any more evidence, any more signs, is fruitless. They've already determined within themselves to reject it. Now, think about the confusion that existed just between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who have come to Jesus, testing him, trying to find fault with him. The Sadducees denied the supernatural intervention of God. They denied miracles. Is that not the case? Look at Acts 23 and verse 8. Oh yeah, did they denied the resurrection? And so what is their mindset even before Jesus does any miracle? Yeah, it's closed. Verse 8 of Acts 23, for Sadducees said there is no resurrection and no angel or spirit, but the Pharisees confessed both. So you ask yourself the question, now why would Sadducees be joining the Pharisees demanding of Jesus a sign when they deny signs? You know, they were really the deists of their time. God was not involved in the affairs of mankind.
That was quite materialistic.
Very materialistic, because all there is matter. They deny spirit. just like our society today. And the Pharisees rejected anything that contradicted their traditions, John 9:16, such as how you keep the Sabbath. How are you ever going to communicate with a group of people like this? Well, Jesus knows it's fruitless. Now go back to Mark 8 and verse 12. And what do you read? But he, that is Jesus, sighed deeply in his spirit and said, why does this generation seek a sign? Assuredly, I say to you, no sign shall be given to this generation. Just think about it. He sighs. The hearts are so hard that even God can't get through. Very, very interesting. We already read Matthew's account that gives, and of course we talked about the textual issues with that. But however, Jesus basically gave them a quick answer and gave no sign. And Matthew 16, in Matthew 16:4, he mentions the sign of Jonah. Remember, that was also mentioned back in Matthew chapter 12, verses 39 and 40. What do you think of that reference? The sign of Jonah. Well, I think we have a pretty good understanding of what he's saying. He's talking about the resurrection, isn't he? When he was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of that fish. And he said, I'm not giving you any more signs except that one. And, you read this and you realize that a lot of these people finally did change their minds, especially on the day of Pentecost. Because the very people that Peter preached to that day, he accused of having crucified the Son of God. The Messiah of God's glory. You by the hands of lawless men did crucify and slay. So the resurrection was the last sign. And fortunately, a good number of them had a change of heart that was able to break their hearts so that they would believe. And so keep this in mind, because as we continue in Matthew's account of all these events fitting together in the teaching, in Matthew chapter 16 is the first time that Jesus predicts his death, burial, and resurrection. But these are the events that are leading up to it. He's taking his disciples, basically his apostles, from this point to this point to this point. There's a progression in their understanding. And I'm really amazed at how the gospel is written, particularly Matthew's gospel, at this particular point. Well, Jesus and his disciples once again get in a boat, and where do they travel? The other side of the Sea of Galilee, to the east side again. So what do you see is going on here? Jesus spends limited time in Galilee because of the constant rejection. He takes respite in the boat and going to the eastern side where he's being received. Then he goes back, he tries again in Galilee, and he travels back. The Sea of Galilee is a natural barrier for him. And it's giving him opportunity to work with his own apostles They're still not understanding this. He hasn't even asked them yet, who do you say that the Son of Man is? Because they haven't come to that yet.
But they are discussing the last, getting the 5,000, but getting the 4,000.
Yeah. And Steve, he's also going to warn them about the leaven of the Pharisees. What does leaven refer to?
They're teaching doctrine.
Yeah, it's called evil influence. Can you just imagine the conflict that's going on in their minds with their religious leaders attacking Jesus? The religious leaders that they have always understood represented God's teaching, and they're colliding with Jesus, and what they're saying about you, well, Jesus is a fraud. He hasn't proven anything that he's the Son of God, and they've been with them, and they're seeing the miracles.
I don't know who to believe.
They don't know what, that's right, they don't know who to believe. But it's come to the point that they're going to have to think on their own, aren't they? This must have been a very tense time for his apostles. And they see the miracles and so on, and then you have this leaven of the Pharisees that's coming into their thinking, and Jesus, I warn you about that. It's corrupting your thinking. You're not seeing the obvious of who I am. So finally he's going to ask him, who do people say I am? Who do you say I am? You see how the text is all coming together for their development? He knows what they're dealing with, and he's addressing it. Well, it looks like our time is gone. We're going to pick up with that on Wednesday evening. Thank you so much for your kind attention.